The year was 1773, and the colony of Massachusetts felt as if it were holding its breath. Every cobblestone street, every smoky tavern corner, every quiet farmhouse kitchen carried the same low hum, whispers of unrest, whispers of revolution. But none felt the tension more sharply than 16-year-old Nathaniel Mercer, who found himself caught between a father loyal to the crown and a community slowly turning toward rebellion. Nathaniel lived in the small port town of Marblehead, where English ships docked with the same mixture of authority and arrogance they always had. His father, Thomas Mercer, ran a successful trading business and believed the colonies owed their prosperity to Britain's firm hand. "Order comes from loyalty," he would say, polishing his spectacles as if polishing the idea itself. Nathaniel had always accepted that. Until now. The change began quietly. It started with the pamphlets. They appeared mysteriously, left on church pews, tucked beneath sacks of grain, slipped into the hands of young men like Nathaniel by strangers who vanished before a question could be asked. Liberty is the right of the Englishman, the papers insisted, and liberty cannot live under tyranny. The words ignited something in Nathaniel, something restless and questioning. One crisp autumn evening, as orange lanterns flickered against gathering dusk, Nathaniel followed the sound of hushed voices to the back room of the Seahorse Tavern. From the hallway, he heard a woman speak, confident, unafraid. "Britain taxes our bread, our tea, our ink, and soon it will tax our very breath. Are we subjects or slaves?" A murmur of agreement rose. Nathaniel recognized two farmers, a blacksmith, and even the mild-mannered schoolmaster among the group. These were people he had known all his life, yet here they were, plotting resistance. He did not notice Samuel Whitaker, his childhood friend, until Sam grabbed his arm and pulled him aside. "You shouldn't be here," Sam whispered, though a spark of excitement shone in his eyes. "But since you are, you should listen. The world is changing, Nat." Nathaniel's heart pounded. He knew that if his father found him here, the consequences would be severe, and yet he stayed. The woman leading the meeting was Abigail Hartwell, a widow who had lost her husband in a dispute with a British officer the previous winter. Her voice, though calm, carried the wounds of that tragedy. "Revolution begins with a whisper," she said, "because at first we are afraid to speak, afraid to imagine a world where the crown no longer commands our lives. But fear," she added, "is the weapon that keeps us obedient." Nathaniel felt as if she were speaking directly to him. The next day brought confrontation. Thomas Mercer found one of the pamphlets tucked inside Nathaniel's coat and slammed it onto the dining table. "This is treason," he thundered. "This poison divides families and destroys nations." Nathaniel trembled but did not look away. "Or it builds new ones," he said quietly. For a long moment, his father stared at him, hurt, angry, confused. "You're just a boy," he finally muttered. "You don't understand the world." Nathaniel wanted to answer, but no words came. Maybe he didn't understand the world, but he understood the feeling rising inside him, the desire to choose it for himself. Days turned into weeks. British patrols grew harsher. Rumors of rebellion spread faster than the cold winter wind. Nathaniel found himself helping Sam carry hidden messages between sympathizers. Nothing dangerous, not yet. Just letters and copies of speeches meant to wake the sleeping. But with each delivery, "Stay inside, look after your mother," Jonathan said, though his eyes lingered a moment longer on Elias. The boy followed him as far as the fence, where he stood trembling in the cold spring air. The moon was high, casting pale light across the road as dozens of men formed a line and marched toward the North Bridge. Elias's heart thudded. This was it. The moment where ordinary men became patriots, where fathers became soldiers, where fear turned into purpose. From the hill beyond the fence, he saw the glimmer of British bayonets approaching the bridge, heard the first shouted commands, felt the roar of his own heartbeat as musket smoke curled beneath the rising dawn.
He did not yet understand the strategy, the politics, or the weight of the day, but as he watched the two forces face each other, Elias understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was the beginning of rebellion. And he, a young patriot with wide, unblinking eyes, had just witnessed his first glimpse of it. The year was 1774, and the colony of Massachusetts felt like a land caught between breaths, still on the outside, but trembling within. Every sunrise brought new rumors, and every sunset carried the rattling tension of a country standing on the edge of a storm. For the people of Boston, the world had become a fragile balance between fear and defiance, between silence and the first brave stirrings of freedom. 14-year-old Abigail Hayes sensed this change long before she understood it. Living above her father's small printing shop on Milk Street, she watched each day as men slipped in and out, their faces tight with worry, their pockets heavy with secret letters. The smell of ink and paper filled the air, mingling with the sound of hurried whispers. Whispers that always stopped the moment Abigail stepped into the room. Her father, Samuel Hayes, was a quiet man, but his printing press spoke loudly. It produced pamphlets filled with bold words like rights, liberty, and resistance. Words the British officials in Boston despised. Words that could get a man arrested. Abigail often caught her father staring at the press late at night, as though he were weighing the cost of every sheet that rolled through its iron teeth. One evening, as Abigail was sorting stacks of paper, a knock sounded at the back door. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. Her father's expression sharpened. "Abigail," he said softly, "upstairs, quickly." She froze. "Is it the soldiers?" "No," he whispered, "it's the others." From the top of the narrow staircase, she watched as 5 men stepped inside. Among them was John Hancock, tall and confident, his voice calm but urgent. Another was young Paul Revere, his boots dusty from travel, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Sam, bargaining over mugs of cider. But after dark, the tavern transformed. Shadows deepened, voices lowered, and the air thickened with rumors carried in from the 13 colonies like drifting embers. 14-year-old Thomas Clark knew the tavern better than anyone. His mother worked in the kitchen, and he helped sweep the floors, gather firewood, and deliver pitchers to the tables. Yet even he sensed that something unusual was stirring that night. His mother's instructions were firm. Finish your work quickly and go straight home. No lingering. But Thomas had seen the way men slipped into the back room, men who were not regular guests, their coats heavy, their faces tense, their voices strangely cautious. He recognized a few of them, Mr. Foster, the schoolmaster, Mr. Green, the blacksmith, and even Colonel Hawthorne, a distant cousin to the governor himself. What business could bring such different men together at the same hour? His curiosity burned hotter than the kitchen hearth. So instead of going home, Thomas crept around the corridor, his steps soft on the wooden planks. He reached the back of the tavern where a small, cracked door stood shut. Candlelight flickered through the edges. He pressed his ear to the wood. Inside, men spoke in urgent whispers. "We cannot wait any longer," Mr. Green muttered. "The crown tightens its grip by the day. Taxes rise, troops multiply, and our voices shrink." "Calm yourself," Colonel Hawthorne said. "If we move too soon, we invite ruin. But if we stay silent, we lose everything." Thomas's breath caught. These were not casual complaints. These were plans. Dangerous plans. Mr. Foster spoke next, his voice trembling with conviction. "The people are ready. What they lack is direction. We must form a council. We must unite the towns. If freedom is to be won, it must begin here, quietly, before it can grow." There was a pause, a long, heavy stillness in which Thomas felt his own heartbeat echo through his ribs. Then the scrape of a chair, a hand slamming the table. "Enough waiting," Green growled. "I say we stand. I say we send word to every tavern, every farm, every shop. Let the crown know we are not afraid." Another voice, calmer but colder, cut through the tension. Thomas recognized it as Mr. Hale, the lawyer who always tipped generously. "If we do this, there is no turning back, no forgiveness. We will be hunted as traitors." Silence again. Finally, Colonel Hawthorne exhaled. "Then let us be traitors, traitors to tyranny." A murmur of agreement swept around the room. A quill scratched across parchment. "We meet again in 3 nights, but no one must know. Not your families, not your friends. Loose tongues cost lives. The crown's spies are everywhere." Thomas took a step back, startled, but his foot struck a loose...
Jefferson nodded. "A document that speaks for every colony, every farmer, every merchant, every child who will inherit this land." Franklin chuckled softly. "And one that might keep our heads attached to our bodies, if we're lucky." Nathaniel felt a shiver run through him. He knew the risk. Everyone did. By writing this declaration, by putting their names on it, these men were committing an act the Crown would consider treason. Yet none hesitated. Hours passed. Jefferson wrote, paused, rewrote. Franklin suggested a phrasing here, a clearer line there. Adams argued passionately over passages about rights, liberty, and the very nature of government. Nathaniel watched every moment, mesmerized. The words being drafted did not feel like simple ink on paper. They felt like a spark catching dry wood, something fragile now but destined to become a blaze. As dusk settled, Franklin called Nathaniel over. "Boy," he said kindly, "fresh ink." Nathaniel hurried forward, his hands trembling slightly. As he placed the small bottle on the desk, Jefferson looked up at him. "Do you understand what this is?" Jefferson asked gently. Nathaniel swallowed. "A document for the Congress, sir." Adams shook his head. "More than that. These words, they are the spirit of a new nation." Franklin added, "And every nation, lad, begins with ink and fire." Nathaniel returned to his corner, heart thundering. He watched Jefferson write the now famous lines, the ones that would echo across centuries. "We hold these truths to be self-evident." With each sentence, the room seemed to brighten, as though the future was pushing its way in through the windows, eager to emerge. As dusk settled, Jefferson placed the quill down. "It is done," he whispered. Adams exhaled deeply. Franklin nodded. The 3 men shared a moment of silence, not of fear but of acceptance. Whatever happened next, the first spark had been struck. Nathaniel stared at the parchment, feeling a strange mix of pride and fear. He knew the British would not let such boldness pass quietly. He knew war loomed like a storm on the horizon, but he also knew something else, something powerful. Tonight, a new idea had taken form, an idea fierce enough to challenge an empire. Ink and fire. The spirit of independence had been drafted, and soon it would set the world ablaze. The winter of 1777 settled over Valley Forge like a heavy shroud, burying the landscape in white and silence. Yet within the rows of crude wooden huts, the Continental Army clung to survival. Hunger gnawed, sickness spread, and the bitter cold cut through blankets like knives. Still, they endured, because freedom demanded more than comfort. It demanded sacrifice. Among the soldiers was 17-year-old Jonah Mercer, his uniform thin, his boots worn, his spirit pulled between pride and fear. 3 months earlier, he had left his small farm in New Jersey, promising his mother he would return as a man who had fought for his...
Abigail held his face again, her voice steady, though her heart trembled. "Then know this. You are fighting for something greater than yourself. Freedom always asks a price. And though it terrifies me, I would never hold you back from doing what is right." Jonah embraced her tightly one last time. "I'll come home," he whispered. "I promise." As she walked away, Jonah stood tall, shoulders squared. The cold still bit, hunger still gnawed, but something inside him had changed. He understood now. Freedom was not paid for only by soldiers. It was paid for by mothers who let their sons go, by families who waited, by love that endured. And the cost of freedom, he realized, was carried on many hearts, not just his own. The night of April 18th, 1775, carried an uneasy stillness across the Massachusetts countryside. A thin crescent moon hung above the darkened road, barely bright enough to guide a traveler's path. But in the small town of Charleston, two horses stood saddled and restless, their breath rising like smoke into the chilly air. Paul Revere tightened the straps of his saddle, his eyes narrowed with determination. The news he carried, British troops marching toward Lexington, was no ordinary message. It was a spark that could ignite an entire nation. Beside him, William Dawes mounted his horse. "We ride fast," Dawes said, "and we ride quiet. The countryside must awake before the soldiers arrive." Revere nodded. Tonight, liberty depends on how quickly the truth can travel. Unseen in the shadows stood 13-year-old Jacob Wells, the local blacksmith's son. He had been delivering mails to a neighbor when he overheard the hurried preparations. Curiosity gripped him, but so did something else, a sense that something monumental was unfolding. Without thinking, he followed the riders at a distance, keeping to the trees, careful not to be seen. The two men galloped across the Charles River and burst onto the open road, hooves pounding like drums warning of an approaching storm. Lanterns flickered in farmhouse windows as Revere shouted the words that would echo across history. "The regulars are out! To arms! To arms!" Jacob's heart raced as he ran along the tree line. He had never seen grown men move with such urgency. Doors flew open. Men emerged half-dressed, grabbing muskets, powder horns, boots. Mothers gathered children. Lanterns lit the night like scattered stars. Revere and Dawes split paths, each heading toward different villages to spread the warning. Revere rode toward Lexington, where Samuel Adams and John Hancock slept, unaware that British troops were marching straight for them.
The night riders had done their part. Now the colonies would rise. The morning of April 19, 1775, arrived with an eerie stillness over the small town of Lexington. The horizon glowed faintly, just enough to outline the bare trees and the rooftops dusted with spring frost. Birds had not yet begun to sing. Even the wind seemed hesitant, as if the world knew something irreversible was about to unfold. 18-year-old Caleb Hart stood among the ranks of the Lexington militiamen on the village green, musket trembling in his hands. He had been roused from bed only an hour earlier by frantic knocking. Paul Revere's warning carried from house to house like a spark on dry grass. "The British are marching. Prepare to stand." Caleb's mother had clutched his coat with shaking hands. "You're my only son," she whispered. "Promise me you'll come home." He had no promise to give, only a determined nod as he stepped into the cold pre-dawn air. Now, as the eastern sky slowly brightened, the militia formed a ragged line. Farmers, blacksmiths, boys barely older than Caleb. Their breaths rose in pale clouds. Captain John Parker paced in front of them, his voice low but firm. "Men, we are not here to start a fight. We stand only to defend our rights and our homes. Remember that." Caleb swallowed hard, his fingers tight around the wooden stock of his musket. His heart pounded so loudly he wondered if the men beside him could hear it. A distant thud echoed from the road. Then another. Drums. Boots. The British column emerged through the morning mist, hundreds of red-coated soldiers marching in perfect formation, their bayonets gleaming like cold silver flames. The contrast was stark. A disciplined, mighty force confronting a small band of colonists who looked more like fathers at a harvest gathering than warriors. The British commander stepped forward. "Disperse," he barked. "Lay down your arms and go home." Parker stood his ground. "We will not be intimidated," he murmured to his men. But to avoid bloodshed, he ordered, "Do not fire unless fired upon." Caleb felt sweat gather on his brow despite the chill. A faint breeze picked up, carrying the sharp tang of gunpowder from the soldiers' primed muskets. For one agonizing moment, no one moved. The world balanced on the edge of a blade. And then a single shot cracked through the dawn. No one ever knew who fired it. But its echo ripped through history. Chaos exploded. British muskets roared, smoke billowing like a sudden storm cloud. Men screamed. Caleb flinched as the line around him
Samuel had been entrusted with something that could alter the future. A sealed packet of documents addressed to Philadelphia's Committee of Safety. Inside were letters, intelligence reports, and secret correspondence between leaders scattered across the colonies. If intercepted by British patrols, those papers could cost lives and extinguish the fragile spark of rebellion. But if delivered safely, they could help unify the movement that was slowly turning whispers of freedom into a force the crown could no longer ignore. He swung his legs over the saddle of his horse, Ember, a steady chestnut mare who had carried him through storms and dark nights. With a firm tug on the reins, they set off down the narrow dirt road that cut between sprawling wheat fields. Cool morning air brushed against Samuel's face, sharpening his senses. He kept his eyes alert. British scouts were said to be patrolling the region, searching for couriers like him. As he rode farther, the sun crept higher, burning away the fog and revealing the rural beauty of the colonies. Stone farmhouses, orchard rows heavy with apples, and wide, untouched pastures. These were the places he was fighting for, not only the land, but the people who worked it, suffered for it, and dreamed of a future where their voices mattered. Around midday, Samuel reached the outskirts of a small village. A group of farmers stood clustered near the well, discussing rumors of troop movements. When they saw him, they lowered their voices, suspicion flickering in their eyes, until one recognized him. "Carter, you're heading to Philadelphia, aren't you?" an older man asked. Samuel nodded cautiously. "Then be careful," the farmer warned. "Redcoats were seen near the mill road. They're searching saddlebags, searching riders." Samuel's grip tightened around the reins. Ember sensed her tension and stamped her hoof against the dirt. But there was no turning back. With a grateful nod, he continued on his journey, choosing a detour through the fields and woodland paths rather than risk the main road. The afternoon sun beat down as he guided Ember through tall grass that swayed like ocean waves. Twisting deer trails carried them deeper into the quiet woods, where the only sounds were rustling leaves and the occasional crack of twigs under hoof. Hours passed, and fatigue began to settle into his bones, but the thought of the fragile movement in Philadelphia pushed him onward. By dusk, the trees thinned, revealing the shivering river that marked the last stretch of his journey. The sky blazed orange and red as the sun dipped low, turning the water into molten gold. Samuel urged Ember across the narrow wooden bridge, praying that no patrols awaited on the other side. When the first lights of Philadelphia finally flickered in the distance, glowing like small stars scattered across the earth, Samuel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The city was alive, buzzing with ideas, arguments, and hopes for a new world. It was here the colony's future was being written line by line, debate by debate. Samuel rode through the gates, exhausted yet triumphant. He dismounted, walked up the steps of the committee's meeting house, and delivered the precious documents into waiting hands. Across the fields he had carried more than messages. He had carried the weight of a nation on the verge of becoming something entirely new. And as night fell, candles flickered like trembling stars across the long wooden tables. The debate resumed, but now the voices carried a new tone, less combative, more determined. Slowly, painstakingly, positions softened, doubt settled, and purpose strengthened.
Near midnight, Thomas finally stood. His voice trembled at first, but steadied as every eye turned toward him. "We are not here to build a perfect nation," he said. "We are here to build a possible one. The soul of a nation is not born from its agreements, but from its courage to choose what is right despite disagreement." Silence followed, deep, almost sacred. Then one by one, the delegates nodded. Pens were raised, documents signed, and a collective breath seemed to fill the hall. That night, history pivoted. The debate had not simply shaped policy, it had shaped identity. It had carved the soul of a nation still centuries from completion, but already destined for greatness. And as Thomas stepped out into the cool midnight air, he felt it, the quiet, powerful beginning of something larger than any man inside that hall. Snow fell in slow, silent waves over Valley Forge, turning the world into a frozen wilderness where hope felt as thin as the soldiers' worn-out coats. Private Samuel Harlow pulled his threadbare blanket tighter around his shoulders as he stared into the dim light of a dying campfire. The winter of 1777 had stripped the Continental Army of almost everything: warmth, food, and certainty. Yet somehow the will to endure flickered stubbornly in their hearts, like the last ember refusing to die. Samuel rubbed his hands together, trying to ignore the sting of frostbite creeping into his fingers. Around him, men huddled close, coughing, shivering, praying. Some whispered stories of home, others simply stared into the snow, lost in exhaustion. The army was starving. Many had gone days with nothing more than a crust of bread or a handful of boiled water flavored with whatever roots they could find. Disease crept through the camp like an invisible enemy, claiming men faster than any British musket. Still, Samuel reminded himself why he was here. He had left behind a small farm in Connecticut, a mother who cried at the kitchen door, and a younger sister who begged him not to go. But he believed in the cause. Freedom was not a word to him, it was a promise, and promises were worth fighting for, even through the cruelest of winters. One morning, after a night so cold the air felt like shattered glass in his lungs, Samuel forced himself out of the hut the men had built from logs and mud. The sky was pale, the sun weak, as if even it struggled against the winter. Across the camp, he saw General Washington riding slowly between the rows of ragged soldiers. General Washington's face was lined with worry, but his posture was steady, dignified, a man carrying the weight of a nation on shoulders that refused to bend. When the general passed Samuel's group, he paused, his gaze meeting the young soldiers. Washington nodded, not a word spoken, yet something powerful exchanged between them. Samuel felt warmth surge through his chest, a spark of strength he thought he had lost. If Washington could endure this, so could they. As weeks dragged on, a new figure arrived at camp. Baron von Steuben, a stern Prussian officer with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. The men were skeptical at first, too cold and too hungry to care about drills or discipline, but Steuben transformed the camp. He corrected their stances, tightened their formations, and taught them how to fight not as desperate individuals.
There was no time for reconciliation. A cannon's roar shattered the morning stillness, and the battlefield erupted into chaos. Smoke curled through the air like living ghosts. Men shouted, muskets fired, and the ground trembled under the weight of boots and cannonballs. Amid the noise, the brothers found themselves advancing toward one another, their paths crossing the same field that had once been their backyard. Caleb raised his musket, his hand shaking. He recognized the same brown eyes he had teased as a boy, the familiar tilt of Nathaniel's jaw, the stubborn set of his shoulders. The thought of firing was unbearable. Could he really shoot his own blood? Nathaniel hesitated as well, the same conflict raging inside him. He had trained for this moment, drilled to aim and fight, yet now hesitation rooted him to the spot. A third soldier stumbled between them, unaware of the familial bond, forcing Caleb to move, musket ready. Nathaniel reacted instinctively, bayonet raised. For a heartbeat, the world slowed. Two brothers, bound by blood, yet divided by duty, stood mere feet apart, staring at one another, hearts pounding, lungs burning with both fear and love. Suddenly, a cannonball whistled overhead, striking the earth near them, hurling debris and sending men sprawling. The explosion snapped them out of their frozen confrontation. Caleb dove toward a ditch, dragging himself and a wounded comrade out of harm's way. Nathaniel did the same, narrowly avoiding a flying splinter. When the smoke cleared, the field was a haze of chaos, injured men and fading cries. Both brothers had survived, but the battle had already claimed hundreds of lives, and neither had fired a shot at the other. They glanced across the field, recognizing the shared misery in one another's eyes. That evening, after the armies retreated, Caleb found Nathaniel on the ridge, nursing a small wound from shrapnel. They approached cautiously, a silent truce between them. "I didn't want this," Caleb said softly. "Neither did I," Nathaniel replied, voice tight. "But the world seems determined to divide us." They sat together for a long while, watching the sunset over the battlefield they had survived, yet hated. The war would continue, tearing families apart, claiming friends and strangers alike. But in that fleeting moment, two brothers found a fragile peace, a reminder that blood could outlast even the bitterness of war. The battlefield had tested them, broken them, and scarred them. Yet it had also reminded them that some bonds were unbreakable, even in a war where brother stood against brother. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the sandy fields of Yorktown. The air was thick with the scent of salt from the nearby James River, mixed with smoke, sweat, and the lingering tang of gunpowder. For months, the Continental Army, allied with French forces, had pressed the siege against British General Cornwallis's troops. Every day had been a test of endurance, strategy, and sheer will. And now the final moment had arrived, the moment when the tide of war could finally turn. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks wiped the grime from his face, his hands still shaking from the intensity of the morning's skirmishes. The cannon fire had begun before dawn, a relentless roar that rattled bones and hearts alike. Around him, soldiers scurried, loading muskets, tending the wounded, and preparing for the next assault. The ground beneath their boots was churned mud and sand, a battlefield transformed into a quagmire of determination and despair. Daniel had joined the fight.
Representation must reflect population, Madison argued, pacing the floor. Without proportional voice, large states will be silenced and the Union will fail before it even begins. Equal representation preserves equality, countered William Patterson of New Jersey. Small states cannot be swallowed by larger ones, or our fragile confederation collapses. Voices rose, chairs creaked, sweat dampened shirts beneath waistcoats. Whitaker could barely keep up with the flurry of ideas, amendments, and proposals. He marveled at how men who had fought side by side against a common enemy now struggled to unite themselves around a common government. Hours turned into days, and days into weeks. Every discussion seemed to reveal a new fault line between North and South, large states and small, merchants and farmers, slaveholders and abolitionists. Whitaker saw frustration turn to fatigue. Some men rested their heads in their hands, while others clenched fists in silent determination. The Union was fragile indeed, and the burden of its survival rested entirely on the shoulders of these delegates. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the polished wooden floor, Franklin rose to speak. His voice, though frail, carried authority. "We must all hang together, gentlemen, or surely we shall all hang separately."
Compromise is not weakness. It is the only path forward for a nation that dares to dream of liberty for all. The room quieted. Whitaker held his breath, sensing that the wisdom in Franklin's words had temporarily bridged the deep divides. Slowly, ideas began to coalesce. Representation could be combined in a bicameral legislature. Powers could be separated to prevent tyranny, and checks could protect both large and small states. Each compromise came with unease, yet with hope. The delegates were not achieving perfection, but they were creating possibility. As the weeks progressed, Whitaker meticulously recorded every word, every vote, every amendment. He watched as the Constitution took shape, a delicate balance of ideals and pragmatism. He saw men who disagreed on almost everything, still working together, laboring under exhaustion, driven by the belief that the Union was worth saving. Finally, after countless debates, revisions, and long nights, the final draft was ready. Washington, standing taller than ever, called the delegates to order. One by one, men stepped forward, pens in hand, signing their names to a document that would define a nation. Whitaker felt a shiver run through him as he watched. The fragile Union, once a concept whispered in revolutionary fervor, now etched in ink, ready to endure the tests of time. As the delegates filed out into the summer evening, Whitaker remained, staring at the finished Constitution, realizing that the fragile threads of compromise, courage, and vision had woven together a new nation, one whose success was uncertain, but whose possibilities were endless. The sun rose over the young city of New York in 1789, casting golden light across bustling streets, cobblestones still echoing with the footsteps of citizens who had once walked through war-torn fields, carrying muskets and prayers alike. The revolution was over. The cannons had fallen silent, the redcoats had retreated, and the colonies, now united as the United States of America, faced a new challenge: building a nation from the fragile dreams of liberty, equality, and hope. Young Thomas Everett, a scribe in the new federal government, stepped out of his small office, inhaling the crisp morning air. His heart swelled with both excitement and apprehension. He had spent years watching independence declared on paper, then fought alongside soldiers who made those words real. Now the ink was no longer enough. Now action